This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In late January, Reuters reported that some 70 U.S. cities, including Chicago and Seattle, have passed resolutions on the Israel-Gaza war, with most calling for a ceasefire. Last night, resolutions were passed in at least two major cities, St. Paul and Cincinnati. Several Connecticut city and town councils have considered similar resolutions. Bridgeport passed one of these non-binding agreements in January. Hartford City Council recently rejected a resolution, and Hamden's town council is considering one. In New Haven, organizers staged an open hearing for a ceasefire at City Hall on Monday after they say the Board of Alders ignored their requests. Coming up, we discuss the significance of these local efforts with our very own Eddy Martinez, who's our breaking news reporter, plus politics and government expert Bilal Sekou. But first, Vice President Kamala Harris has recently issued a similar call on the federal level.
And given the immense scale of suffering in Gaza, there must be an immediate ceasefire for at least the next 6 weeks, which is what is currently on the table.
And here to discuss the significance of Sunday's announcement and more is Greg Myrie, who's an NPR national security correspondent. Thank you so much, Greg, for joining us this morning.
Oh, sure thing. My pleasure.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Greg, you were recently reporting at Tel Aviv and following the ceasefire developments. Can you talk about the importance of Vice President Harris's announcement that this is now on the table? Can you tell us what does that mean?
Sure. I think what is significant here is we're seeing the U.S. go public with what it had been saying privately to Israel for some time. It had been urging behind the scenes for Israel to recalibrate its operations in Gaza, saying far too many civilians are being killed there. More than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in the past 5 months. Now, this includes both civilians and Hamas militants. About 1,500 Israelis have been killed since the Hamas attacks last October. And Israel has been saying the U.S. has been saying to Israel privately, you cannot keep operations going as they are in terms of the number of civilians that are being killed, even if this is not the intent. And now we're seeing it very publicly, and Vice President Harris made this call on Sunday, and it really did mark an escalation in the public rhetoric that the U.S. is directing towards Israel. And in addition to what it's telling Israel about military operations, the U.S. is also emphasizing that much more humanitarian aid has to get into Gaza. The Gazans a majority of them, half to two-thirds, are squeezed down in the very southern tip of the Gaza Strip. Not enough aid is getting through, not only there, but in the north, where the Israeli military is in full control. There's several 100,000 Palestinians still there. They're getting very, very little aid. And so the U.S. on both of these fronts, on the military front and on the humanitarian front, the U.S. is emphasizing that Israel needs to do something about this.
And so would you characterize this as a humanitarian ceasefire then?
Well, that would be certainly a big part of it. Again, it would stop the killing, hopefully. The intent here is we had a ceasefire back at the end of November. It lasted for a week. Israeli hostages, more than 100 of them were released. Palestinian prisoners, more than 200 of them were released. So yes, absolutely a ceasefire. And now they're talking about 6 weeks for this ceasefire would provide absolutely welcome relief, allow more humanitarian aid to get in without the dangers of an ongoing shooting conflict. So yeah, that would be a big part of it. But it would also involve the additional exchange of people on both sides. Hamas is holding more than 130 hostages. There's talk about they would release 40 or so of them. The Hamas wants the release of Palestinian political prisoners. We don't know how many might be involved. We're hearing some talk of several hundred. So that would be a big part of it too. The combination of the shooting would cease, more humanitarian aid would get in, and prisoners and hostages would be exchanged.
So, with what you're saying, would a true ceasefire include both an end to the violence in Gaza and a release on hostages on both sides? Is that what you're saying?
Well, this is really one of the sticking points.
Sure.
The Israelis have said we are willing to look at a temporary ceasefire, but Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli military say their intent remains to eliminate Hamas, certainly as a military force, and they want to drive them out of Gaza altogether. And therefore, they're saying we'll accept a temporary truce. And again, what's on the table is an initial 6-week ceasefire. Hamas wants a longer ceasefire. There's some talk that maybe they would accept 6 weeks and then it could be extended. But their goal is to get to a permanent ceasefire, effectively ending the war, and then the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. So this is where the two sides, there's a big difference, especially when it comes to sort of the longer term goals, which is why it seems you could get something in the shorter term, or perhaps even a 6-week truce. But beyond that, the Israelis seem to be opposed to anything longer. Hamas wants something that is much longer and indeed becomes permanent.
And how do these negotiations figure into the larger UN proposals? You know, we've seen, I think this is the third one we're seeing this week in terms of the draft resolutions. Can you talk about how this relates to that?
Sure. I mean, the UN has put forward several ideas about ceasefires. The U.S. has vetoed it 3 times, saying that it can't just be a ceasefire. You need to work out some other issues as well, the exchange of hostages and prisoners. The U.S. has supported Israel's effort to eliminate Hamas as a force in Gaza. So the U.S. continues to be supportive of that, even while it's critical of the way Israel is carrying out this military operation. And I think the really important point to understand here is, a ceasefire in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We've had countless ceasefires over the years. The point is, can you turn it into a permanent cessation of hostilities and then into some sort of process that will lead to a longer term resolution. So again, a ceasefire, whether it's a week or 6 weeks, provides blessed relief, especially for civilians in Gaza who are suffering so much, but it doesn't answer some of these longer term questions. And because the fighting has been so intense in this round over the past 5 months, the issues are even bigger. So many homes in Gaza have been destroyed. So many Palestinians are living in tents. Even if the fighting stops and they were returned to the part of Gaza where they're from, many of their houses have been destroyed. The economy has been destroyed. You're looking at a massive reconstruction effort that would have to take place. And then the larger issue is, what would the relationship, what would Hamas's role be in Gaza? Would it still be in charge? Israel says it's not going to allow that. If not, who would be in charge of Gaza? So these are questions that have absolutely no clear answers at this point.
And just a quick reminder for our listeners that you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We're going to take a quick call from Susan, who is calling from Wallingford. Susan, you're on the air. Susan,
the fact that when we're talking about Gaza releasing hostages and Israel releasing prisoners, that there's a huge difference there. I thought I heard somebody say something about everybody releasing hostages. The people that Israel is looking to release are criminals. They're not, or they've been either accused or convicted of criminal activity. They are not hostages. The people that Gaza is holding, that is part of the discussion, are hostages. They are innocent people that were ripped from their homes, including women and children, including children too young to be criminals. There's babies and toddlers. So I think that's a really significant difference. I also wanted to comment on the word ceasefire. So we're not or I wouldn't, advocate for Israel to cease fire. A ceasefire is an agreement between both parties, so both parties need to agree to a ceasefire and adhere to that ceasefire, which is what has been the problem in the past, is that Gaza or the Hamas has agreed to a ceasefire and then come back with more terrorist activity.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, for calling in with your comments. Greg, what's your response to what Susan has to say?
Yeah. She raises some very good points, and I can break those down. Hamas is holding right now a little over 130 hostages, six mostly Israelis. Six of them at least, are dual nationals, American citizens and Israeli citizens. Of these 130, Israel says they believe at least 31 of them are dead, probably more. So Hamas has a number of bodies they took back to Gaza after their October 7th attack. There may be some who have been killed by the Israeli bombing operations there. So we're talking maybe 100 of those hostages alive. It's a mix of civilians, probably a majority of civilians, as long as some Israeli soldiers. And again, what seems to be on the table is the possibility of releasing 40 Israeli civilians. And Hamas will probably hold on to the Israeli soldiers that it's still holding, as well as the bodies of dead Israelis. So that's on the Hamas side. Israel has about 7,000 Palestinians in prisons. Many of them have been convicted, some of murder, mass murder of Israeli citizens, as well as some who've been picked up quite recently and are being held without charges. So it really runs the gamut. And as I said, back in November, Israel released a little over 200 Palestinian prisoners. Hamas released a little over 100 hostages. They're trying to work out some formula. Hamas wants some of its more prominent figures, are people who have been convicted of very serious crimes, released. Israel says it's not willing to do that. It will release some prisoners, but probably those convicted of lesser crimes or those being held without charge.
And Greg, earlier we talked about humanitarian aid and the need for more aid to go into Gaza. And we also spoke with AmeriCares, which is a humanitarian organization that's based here in Connecticut. And AmeriCares is one of many humanitarian organizations who are pushing for a humanitarian ceasefire. And here we're going to listen from CEO Christine Squires responding to the potential for a 6-week ceasefire.
So this ceasefire is the only hope to alleviate life-threatening shortages of medicines, food, water for nearly 2 million people in Gaza. People are starving, hospitals are barely functioning, and there's overcrowding and horrible sanitation and living conditions. And these are also leading to the rapid spread of disease. Lack of medicines has added to the misery of daily life in Gaza, and even basic illnesses can become deadly. So thousands more could die unless something is done right away. In the recent weeks, only a trickle of aid has gotten in, nowhere near what's needed. Even the aid that's been delivered has been difficult to get to the people who need it. Humanitarian workers have been unable to move around safely. This is also why we need a ceasefire. We saw a significant increase in aid during the pause back in late November and the fighting, and this would allow, if we would get a ceasefire now, even a larger volume of aid to get through.
And so Christine Squires also noted that there are about 13 tons of medicine and supplies waiting just over the border in Egypt that's ready to go. And she also said that a temporary ceasefire would be better than where we are today. Greg, can you respond to what Christine has to say?
Well, she's absolutely correct. There's a desperate need to get more aid, and that includes food and medicine, sanitation efforts. In southern Gaza, there are this 1 million to 1.5 million people. The aid is just across the border in Egypt, so if it can get in, it can have an impact quite quickly. Some of the most serious problems we're seeing are in northern Gaza, where maybe there's only a few hundred Palestinians who remain in their homes or their home areas, but very little aid is getting there. So even though it's been pretty depopulated in the north of Gaza, aid has not been getting there. That's where we're seeing the highest rates of child malnutrition, some reports of starvation, and there a ceasefire is absolutely essential, because we've seen a problem where even trucks that are getting in, desperate Palestinians mobbed the trucks. There was a horrible incident last week where 100 people died. Apparently some combination of storming the trucks, and they may have been run over, Israeli troops firing on some of them. So there's just not an orderly, large-scale way to meet the humanitarian needs of Palestinians and in northern Gaza in particular.
So we got to go to a break pretty soon here, but I want to take one more quick call. Jake from Stanford. Jake, you are on the line.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to the previous caller's comment about hostages versus prisoners, and I think your guest spoke to this as well, but I think it's worth emphasizing that the messaging that, the people who are detained by Israel are prisoners instead of hostages is just not necessarily true. And they could be political prisoners, they can be, detained without charge, they could be under military detention, and I think that's just really important to emphasize.
Well, thank you so much, Jake, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Greg, quick response to what Jake has to say?
No, Jake's absolutely right. Again, we're talking about 7,000 Palestinians. They range from Hamas members who carried out mass killings to people who have just been picked up without charge and may never be charged. And so it really runs the gamut.
Well, thank you, Jake, again for calling in. And you've been listening to Greg Myrie, who's an NPR national security correspondent. Greg, thank you so very much for being with us today.
Sure thing. My pleasure.
And coming up, we hear about some local non-binding ceasefire resolutions in Connecticut and what exactly they mean. You can also join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We just heard about the latest diplomatic negotiations around a ceasefire in Gaza happening at the federal level. But at the local level, several town and city governments are considering non-binding ceasefire resolutions here in Connecticut. And with the latest is Eddy Martinez, who's our breaking news reporter and general assignment reporter here at Connecticut Public. Thank you so much, Eddy, for being with us today.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for having me.
And also to help us better understand the function and symbolism of these local efforts is Dr. Bilal Sekou, who's an associate professor of politics and government at the University of Hartford. Thank you so much, Bilal, for being with us today.
Thanks a lot for having me on, and go Hawks.
That's the way to start this conversation, Dr. Sekou. And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation, or if you want to respond to what Dr. Sekou just said, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Eddy, I want to start with you. You've been covering these towns and cities that have been pushing for ceasefire resolutions. Can you give us an idea which towns have done that, have pushed for or passed ceasefire resolutions?
Yeah, over the last few months, there's been several towns and cities throughout the state that have been pushing for non-binding ceasefire resolutions, including Bridgeport, Hamden. I understand that there's been efforts on the way to try to get them to at least be considered in New Haven, and also efforts to see if they can be heard in Hartford as well.
And based on your reporting, too, and your conversations with people on the ground, there's been some pushback even after Bridgeport passed a resolution. So what do we know about that?
Yeah, so the pushback happened almost immediately after the ceasefire resolution was passed. And that in itself was also kind of a controversial thing where they had to rework language within the resolution to make it more palatable to critics, but even then afterwards, there was opposition to it, and in general, people had criticisms over the resolution in general because they think that some parts language in the resolutions or sections of the resolution could be construed as anti-Semitic or unfairly attack Israel or simply just not factual.
And so earlier we mentioned quickly that New Haven is also looking into this, and organizers have staged public hearings at New Haven City Hall after they said that their requests were ignored. Are you hearing about this, Eddy, New Haven specifically?
Yes, a little bit of what's going on in New Haven, and what I also understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is also that the next meetings that are to be held regarding the ceasefire resolution are going to be done virtually instead of in person, which is interesting because a lot of these resolution hearings that have been held in person have been filled up with supporters and opponents. Who have packed the room and have used this as an opportunity to get their message across as on local media as well.
And we'll get into more on the support and opposition soon. But Dr. Sekou, we know these resolutions are non-binding and mostly symbolic. So what's your response of the function for these resolutions? Talk about the why and also why now of it all.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, the reason this issue has come up is because this is an issue and a concern of people all around the world, not just the country. And so to see something like this, emerge at the local level, I think, to me, is a good thing because I think these are the kinds of discussions that communities need to be having, at the local level. And I say that primarily because, what resolutions in general represent are an expression of one, the governing body of that particular local community, but it also becomes an expression of the people who live in that community if, in an effort to weigh in on, critical issues that we are facing, whether in the country or around the world. But, as Eddy has pointed out, these also can be very contentious sort of, events that can occur where you have, activist groups that turn out on both sides of a particular issue. And of course, this long simmering conflict in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinian people has been something that's been front and center of American foreign policy for decades. And so, quite naturally, there are a lot of strong emotions on both sides of this particular issue. And what's especially important about it is that it also is an issue that will affect our presidential politics this year because it is an issue, as your previous guest talked about, with the vice president coming out calling for a ceasefire, and even listening to the callers who talk about the difference between political prisoners versus hostages versus what exactly is a ceasefire just tells you just how difficult this particular issue is.
Right. And I was going to say there are so many layers here to unpack. It's going to take more than this hour, really, to do that. And Eddy, with what Dr. Sekou just said, and also earlier we talked about the ceasefire, including releasing hostages, releasing prisoners, and also bringing in humanitarian aid. What are you hearing from advocates about their hopes for these resolutions, and what do they hope the impact will be?
Yeah. One thing that I keep hearing from advocates and supporters is that they want to essentially pressure from below local representatives to support a ceasefire, and then essentially like trickle upwards to have the state also get on board, and then eventually pressure federal officials to consider limiting aid or calling for a ceasefire.
And Dr. Sekou earlier talked about the resolutions being a way for communities to express what they're feeling. What's your sense about how these sorts of resolutions do or don't interrupt the normal going-ons of town and city council meetings? For example, I think we talked about broken streetlights, the potholes, and all of that. So what is your sense about how these resolutions, do they interrupt normal ongoings or do they not? Dr. Sekou, are you there?
Oh, okay. I thought that was for Eddy.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah. And you know what I think is important about this, and I'll make a quick comparison. I went to college in the 80s, and during that period, there was the anti-apartheid movement. And one of the things that struck me about that movement was that there was a lot of resolutions at the local level to get, businesses to disinvest in South Africa. There were efforts at colleges and universities like the one I attended where we pressured our university to disinvest. And eventually that bottom up process actually led to changes in U.S. policy. So when Eddy talks about, applying pressure to lawmakers, public officials, eventually coming from the bottom, because these communities make up districts, and these districts are represented by political officials who are in Washington, who will be making votes on things like military aid, for example, humanitarian aid. And so, in that sense, while these are non-binding and can be viewed as quite symbolic, but at the same time they can be very substantive if they apply pressure from below. That political leaders who risk alienating their constituents when there's a strong sort of consensus around something, they're also risking their ability to win office. And we've got elections coming up, in 2024. And as I said before, this is the pressure that's on the Biden administration right now. This is hurting him in some battleground states, the Arab American community in a place like Michigan and in a particular city like Dearborn and Detroit, where I'm from, they have a take on this issue that leads them to believe that Joe Biden is not doing what they think he should be doing and not putting enough pressure on the state of Israel to move towards a ceasefire. And certainly the two-state solution is another issue that's hanging there as well. And so I think, again, these have the potential, as Eddy talked about, to really move local officials, to move politicians who may in fact be making critical votes on these issues.
And following up with what you just said, Dr. Sekou, this is definitely something that I think a lot of towns and cities are navigating and trying to maneuver. So there has been a recent ceasefire resolution that failed in Hartford. Fox 11 reported on that. And City Councilor Josh Mitchum told the outlet that he helped author the resolution after constituents came to him. Mitchum himself is Jewish, but leaders from the Jewish Federation of Hartford emphasized that municipal officials have no power over foreign policy and instead need to deal with crime and budgets and drugs and other more urgent issues. So what are your thoughts about that, Dr. Sekou?
Yeah. I mean, and obviously that's the tension. I mean, if you're in the local level, things like, do we have, the right amount of policing to deal with issues of crime in the community? Do we have the right amount of resources to deal with some of the social, and cultural challenges that many cities face? And so, front and center, those are the issues, obviously, that people at the local community care a great deal about. But I think one of the challenges is that, you don't see the kind of pressure, perhaps from activists, for example, to see resolutions like this get pushed forward. You don't see that same sort of community organizing, an effective kind of community organizing at the local level to deal with some of those challenges you see in communities. And to be frank, I mean, for people who are critical of these kinds of resolutions, critical of the Biden administration, they look at this and they have this real strong perception that we're sending money to foreign countries and foreign wars, and we're not making those investments at the local level. So it's understandable for that kind of tension to play out. And then, as I said before, you add on to this issues around, the potential of being described as being anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. I mean, all of those tensions are playing out on an issue like this. And again, this is one that's decades long conflict that doesn't seem to lend itself to an easy solution. The Netanyahu administration has clearly been opposed to a two-state solution, which is what many of these activists are in favor of. So there's a lot in the background on this issue, I think, that makes it really difficult and challenging.
And related to what you're saying as well, Dr. Sekou, we also spoke with Georgetown professor of government, Dr. Nadia Brown. She touched on the symbolism and function of local resolutions as well, and also the bigger question of why.
And I think that's, this is happening more and more because there is this big disconnect between the big tent party that the Democrats have built, right? And so there are traditional Democrats who are thinking about geopolitics in the ways that we did in the early 2000s and before. There are younger voters, there are progressives who are seeing what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and they're thinking about imperialism, colonialism, genocide, domicide, and parts of the conversation that just weren't happening right later. So how is the Democratic Party going to hold this group of people?
Dr. Sekou, what's your response to what Dr. Brown has to say?
Right. First of all, nice to hear from a friend and colleague, Nadia, weighing in on this issue. But I think she raises, at least going national for a moment, the Democratic Party is also deeply divided on this issue. There's a progressive wing of the party that's small, not as powerful as some of the critics of the Democratic Party suggest that they control the agenda, but they clearly, are in favor of a ceasefire. They're clearly in favor of a certain kind of resolution to this issue that will lead to a two-state solution and a safe and secure Israel also along with that. But then again, there are lots of people who are really angry about the deaths of civilians that, your earlier guest talked about the level of destruction that's going on, what feels to them like a form of collective punishment for what was a horrifying, act on the part of Hamas back in October. And so, that, plays into this tension. But as I said before, at the local level, politicians really don't have a as clear a way to really know or gauge where their sort of constituents are at always. The people who make the phone calls are not necessarily a good cross section of the community that they, represent. But if you see these kinds of resolutions being passed in city after city in a state like Connecticut, then I think someone like Chris Murphy or Dick Blumenthal would have to pay attention in the Senate. And depending on where those communities are at, any of the any of the five U.S. reps would have to pay attention if they see this groundswell of support for a ceasefire resolution in their district.
And I just want to take a quick moment here to read a comment we received from Sayumi Harb on Facebook, who shares, "My husband had 12 family members killed by Israel in Gaza. The amount of ongoing trauma we endure during the ongoing genocide, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing is unfathomable." Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Sayumi, and we hope to follow up with you at some point. And I also want to take a moment to play a clip from Wesleyan political science professor Eddy Martinez. She was one of more than 1,000 political science professors who signed a letter to New England legislators back in November pushing for a ceasefire resolution.
Even if you manage to send strong signals to, your Connecticut senators, there's many other senators that are out there, right? So again, the way that I look at it is that, okay, this is a way to send a signal about where public opinion is, or at least where vocal public opinion is. Just because these get passed doesn't mean that that's where the majority stands, right? It just means that people that feel strongly enough to mobilize, that's where the voices that feel strongest may be. But it does present, I think, an opportunity to use this as a way, like I said, to make use of democratic process, because we really also, so there's the Gaza crisis, but we are also living in a time where democracy in and of itself, I think, is questioned. And we see a questioning of democratic processes and democratic institutions, right? So this may not solve the Gaza crisis, but this may actually have other effects on how young people engage with democratic processes, or how people at the local level engage with democratic processes and democratic institutions.
Dr. Sekou, with what Emmy just said, can you talk about why were the recipients of this letter New England lawmakers and not, say, President Joe Biden?
Obviously, New England lawmakers are the ones who will, take the critical votes in Congress on, for example, funding. If there is any involvement on the part of the U.S. with a sort of post-reconstruction of Gaza, then the U.S. and U.S. dollars, taxpayer dollars, will go to that effort as well. I think ultimately the U.S., as the sort of lone global superpower, though there are people who are challenging the U.S. sort of position as that, inevitably will be at the table, when these discussions occur. But there are, there's real tension between Netanyahu and Biden. They're not the best of friends, and they definitely see a different sort of future for that region. And, that's part of the difficulty. And so to me, and I really appreciate those comments that were made, because to me, the value of this exercise is that these are things that are happening at the local level. And when we can engage people in our democracy, especially given the low level of belief that the political system is responsive, on the part of a lot of Americans, and the lack of engagement on the part of many people, to see people at the local community having these debates, I think, is just important to the health of our democracy.
And just a quick note for our listeners that genocide hasn't been charged against Israel, but it has been raised. Eddy, I want to ask you for your response as well to the comments that Wesleyan professor Emmy Madison made. Anything that she said jumped out to you?
Yeah, I just echo what Dr. Sekou, I'm sorry, what the doctor said about what's going on, and I also just wanted to add, about a thing about like language, like the language itself. So, one thing that I noticed is within these resolutions is also like language and the fact that there's like even the ones that have gotten passed have had to have been reworked due to concerns over what opponents label as false or misleading information, including labeling what is happening in Gaza as a genocide, or referring to Israel as an apartheid state.
Thank you so much for that, Eddy. You've been listening to Eddy Martinez, who's a Connecticut Public reporter, and Dr. Bilal Sekou, who's an associate professor of politics and government at the University of Hartford, both of whom will be continuing this conversation with us. So stick around as we continue this chat after a break. You can also join us 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Back with us to discuss the debates unfolding in Connecticut around local non-binding ceasefire resolutions is Eddy Martinez, who's our Connecticut Public reporter, as well as Dr. Bilal Sekou, who's an associate professor of politics and government at the University of Hartford. So, Eddy, earlier we've been talking a lot about supporters of the ceasefire resolutions. Can you tell us more about some of the opposition to these resolutions that you've heard? Eddy, are you there?
Yeah.
Nope.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Go for it.
Yeah. So, in general, I think I touched upon this a little bit previously, but in general, there's several sources of opposition to these resolutions, and one is the sense that the language in these documents is anti-Semitic, either due to calling Israel an apartheid state or other criticisms of the state, for example, labeling what's going on in Gaza as a genocide. And I think and there's also the sense that the resolutions either do little, or the legislators at the municipal level are not knowledgeable about a foreign event or topic to take such action with such a resolution. You see opponents commonly say that these legislators simply don't know what is happening, or this isn't their business.
And that's something that we will get into more detail in a little bit. Just want to take a moment to remind our listeners that you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And now I'm going to take a quick call from Alexandria. Alexandria, you are on the line.
Hello, Catherine. Thank you so much for having me. And it's very nice to join the conversation live. And I also wanted to thank Eddy for his coverage. I've been watching his coverage since the Bridgeport resolution, so it's very, very good to see clear, detailed reporting. But I am joining today. Hopefully, I can address some of the points from the kind of opposition to these resolutions. So I'm actually a University of Hartford alumni, and over the past few years, I have spent time studying communications that were basically historical in nature, coming out of Russia, specifically concerning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also rhetoric on sort of Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so when these resolutions kind of started locally appearing in Connecticut, I have noticed a very, very strange trend, something that I have studied sort of academically, but never really see it materialize in, United States, for example. And my family immigrated to the U.S. outside of the former Soviet bloc. So they've sort of witnessed a similar campaign in the 70s in terms of position on Israel, but they witnessed it in Russia. So I just wanted to address a few points, and I've been working a little bit with local Jewish communities in terms of kind of combating these resolutions on language, right? So some of the most difficult portions of the resolutions is the fact that Israel is essentially accused of genocide and apartheid. And this isn't new, right? So there has already been a campaign like that in the former Soviet bloc. And essentially this campaign is anti-Semitic because it, without evidence, right, accuses Israel of targeting civilians rather than Hamas, while, Israeli goal is the destruction of Hamas. So essentially we have groups of Palestinians, huge populations of women and children that are stuck between Israeli defense forces, which are trying to get to Hamas, and Hamas using the civilians as sort of a shield. And then we end up being with, having a very high amount of casualties. And for me, watching resolutions on the town level, knowing and speaking closely with our Muslim community members, with the Jewish community members, we essentially have communities in Connecticut. Both are American Palestinians or American Jews with families that are part of this war zone. And what is happening is a moral referendum on general population. So essentially we're going to say, okay, well, the portions of the Jewish communities are now these genocidal murderers, and we're going to declare that a fact, while Palestinian folks are the only victims. That's not the true narrative of the war. War is a horrible situation.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Alexandria, for sharing your story with us and your comments, and appreciate your love for Eddy and this conversation as well. And Eddy, you touched on a lot of these points that Alexandria is just making, and how some of these concerns around anti-Semitism has come back up in Bridgeport. So can you talk about what's next there? Given this resolution has passed, what are you expecting next in Bridgeport?
It's up in the air. As of right now, there hasn't been any movement so far, politically there has been movement on the opponent side to have this rescinded, but so far right now there hasn't been any other discussions about this have been tabled for now. But there is opposition to this, and including getting local business owners or developers to voice their opposition in order to just express just how displeased they are with the resolution.
And Eddy, we also know that there are some organizers behind the ceasefire resolutions who are also Jewish, right?
Yes. Some of them are either Jewish American or Israeli American, and also supporters as well.
Yeah. If I can jump in for just a second, I really appreciate, what the caller was doing, and also Eddy's comments, because I think part of, it's at the heart of this that makes it so difficult is that the issues around language and also competing narratives, right, and stories that are being told. And so, for people who, look at the, look through from the lens of the plight of the Palestinian people, then using language like occupation, Zionism, apartheid are things that they routinely use, for example, right, to sort of describe the status of the Palestinian people. On the other hand, from, the supporters of the Israel and the Jewish state, talking about, the trauma and the genocidal effort during World War II against the Jewish people, and the creation of the state of Israel, and the right to return to Israel becomes a part of the narrative that's also been told. And so, part of what makes this so difficult is that we don't really have a common language that we all use to even talk about the region, to talk about the conflict itself. And I think that's a part of what makes this so difficult, because the caller was absolutely right. And again, for people who oppose, for them, what is an occupation and an apartheid-like state, it's very easy and very clear for them. On the other hand, for people who believe in the right of the Jewish people to have a place where they can be safe and, and be able to defend themselves is also quite paramount. And trying to find some place where people are able to meet and find some agreement, to me, just speaks to why this has been such a difficult conflict that's been decades in the making.
And getting back into the opposition for just a moment here, I also want to play a clip from Rabbi Benjamin Skolnick during Hamden's town council hearing recently.
I care about Hamden. This is not the Hamden way. This is not the way to do Hamden. This is not the way to create a community. This is the way to divide, not unite. So here is my concrete, specific, personal offer as a rabbi in this community. I ask those who support this resolution to enter into a dialogue with those who oppose the resolution. I will personally go anywhere, anytime, any day of the week to talk with you, starting with tomorrow morning. I am willing to talk under any guidelines that you propose, but I would like to understand you better, and I want you to understand us better. This would be in the spirit of Hamden. If you're not willing to have such a dialogue, I'd like to know why not. You are in pain. Let us hear and respect that pain. But you must understand that we are in terrible pain too, and you should be willing to hear and respect our pain.
We also want to take another moment here to hear from Dr. Nadia Brown at Georgetown again, who shares one insight about how the internet and the digital spread of information has changed politics. So let's take a quick listen.
I think that why this is happening now is a byproduct of technology and the media. And, I'm a geriatric millennial. So I remember watching the Iraq War in 2000, and what was that, 3? And like the scenes from the bombings kind of looking like a video game, right? Kind of like detached, not really, grainy, just not good quality. And so fast forward 20 years later, you can exactly see the kind of like toll on human suffering that this has, right? The quality of reporting, the quality of, again, social media with, people being able to upload things to Instagram and to really see what's happening in Gaza and as well in Israel, right? It's, people have, the world has been made smaller in ways that I think, are incredibly useful for democracy.
So we really wanted to get into this idea that our heartstrings are really tugged differently because we are much more exposed to information on social media and whatnots. And Eddy, we got about 2 minutes here, but 30 seconds. Some of your final thoughts here, especially with what Dr. Brown has to say. Eddy, are you there? Eddy,
sorry about that. Yeah. So I totally agree with what she said, and I just from observing what people are saying, like that is driving a lot of people. Just seeing people being wounded or killed, or even seeing how Palestinians in Gaza are simply trying to survive through social media. I think it just gives a more immediate sense of what's going on, as opposed to what happened in Iraq in 2003, which is more than 20 years ago. I think that she's completely right that there is a level of immediacy that you just didn't have back then that just makes this a much more urgent, even more urgent topic, which has, and there's been previous opposition to Israeli actions in Gaza and in the West Bank over several decades. But I think with this going on, I think it's definitely been a lot more. We've seen more support for this over the last few months.
Well, Dr. Sekou, 30 seconds with what Eddy and Dr. Brown has to say.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, the ability of people at in areas that are being sort of devastated, whether the Israelis with the initial invasion by Hamas into Israel or what's been going on now, people have cell phones. They're able to, load something up very quickly to the internet. It goes not just national, but international. And that's just something we did not have the capacity to do in previous conflicts. And so now everybody can report what's going on the ground in a way that, for people who follow this stuff over the internet, it can shock the sensibilities.
Well, thank you so much. You've been listening to Dr. Bilal Sekou at the University of Hartford and Eddy Martinez, who's our Connecticut Public reporter. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.